On March 14, 1849, the county courthouse in Lowndes County, Alabama, burned to the ground in what officials called an unfortunate accident caused by an overturned lamp. But among the ashes, investigators found something that didn't match the official story. 3 sets of human remains in the basement, chained to iron rings embedded in the stone walls. The county clerk's records from 1847 to 1849 were completely destroyed, along with property deeds, marriage certificates, and most crucially, the probate documents for the Sutton estate. For over a century, descendants of Lowndes County families have whispered about what really happened at Bell River Plantation during those 2 years, about the twin daughters of Colonel Nathaniel Sutton, and about the slave named Marcus, who somehow managed to document everything before he vanished. What you're about to hear has been pieced together from surviving letters, medical records from Mobile, and testimonies given to a Northern Abolitionist society that was sealed until 1963. Before we continue with the story of the Sutton sisters and the secrets that consumed an entire community, we uncover the darkest corners of American history that textbooks won't touch. And leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We love knowing where our audience discovers these forgotten horrors. The truth about Bell River Plantation begins not with the fire, but with a funeral 2 years earlier, and with 2 women who had been taught that survival meant absolute control. Lowndes County in 1847 stretched across some of the richest cotton-growing soil in Alabama, black earth that made men wealthy and carved the landscape into kingdoms of white columned houses surrounded by fields that reached the horizon. The county seat of Hayneville sat at the center of it all, a collection of brick buildings and dirt streets where planters conducted business, and their wives pretended not to know where the family wealth truly came from. Bell River Plantation lay 8 miles south of town, accessible only by a private road that wound through stands of water oak and across 2 tributaries of the Alabama River. Colonel Nathaniel Sutton had built the main house in 1828, a 3-story structure with 12 rooms and a separate kitchen building connected by a covered walkway. The slave quarters, 24 cabins arranged in 2 precise rows, sat a quarter-mile behind the main house, close enough to be summoned quickly, far enough that the colonel didn't have to hear the sounds of the lives he owned. The colonel had made his fortune in cotton, but his reputation came from something else entirely. He'd served in the Creek War under Andrew Jackson, and brought back from that conflict a belief that humans could be improved through careful breeding, the same way one improved livestock. His library contained medical texts from Philadelphia, agricultural journals from Virginia, and personal correspondence with men at universities who shared his convictions about racial hierarchies and biological destiny. He kept meticulous records, measurements, observations, genealogies traced back 3 generations. His neighbors called him eccentric but brilliant. His slaves called him something else entirely, though never where white ears could hear. The colonel never married. Instead, he'd purchased a slave woman named Ruth in 1824 from a Charleston trader, a woman described in the bill of sale as of uncommonly fair complexion and genteel bearing. Ruth gave birth to twin daughters in 1825, Sarah and Catherine. The colonel raised them in the main house, educated them with tutors from Mobile, dressed them in fine clothes ordered from New Orleans. But he never freed them. He never acknowledged them as his daughters in any legal document. On paper, they remained his property, an arrangement that gave him absolute authority over every aspect of their existence. Sarah and Catherine grew up in a peculiar isolation. They learned to read and write, to paint watercolors and play the pianoforte. They studied literature and mathematics, geography and French, but they rarely left the plantation grounds. The colonel controlled who visited and when, screening every potential social contact through his own rigid criteria. He told them they were special, that they had been given advantages that elevated them above their station, but that the world beyond Bell River would never understand or accept them. He taught them that safety came from seclusion, that trust was a weakness and that power, however limited, was the only currency that mattered. The twins learned these lessons too well. They developed their own language of glances and gestures, finishing each other's sentences, sometimes falling silent for days and communicating only through notes passed across the dinner table. They wore identical dresses in coordinating colors, Sarah in deep green, Catherine in midnight blue. They read the same books at the same pace, one starting at the front, one at the back, meeting in the middle. They shared everything: hairbrushes, jewelry, secrets, and eventually something darker. Their mother Ruth died in 1839, officially from pneumonia, though the slave quarters whispered about bruises on her arms and fear in her eyes during her final weeks. After her death, the colonel's control over his daughters tightened like a noose. He installed locks on their bedroom doors that could only be opened from the outside. He required them to submit weekly written reports on their activities, their thoughts, their dreams. He began testing them, leaving valuables in obvious places to see if they would steal, introducing them to male visitors to observe their reactions, creating situations designed to reveal any hidden rebellions. The plantation itself prospered through these years. By 1847, the colonel owned 63 enslaved people whose labor produced 142 bales of cotton annually. He sold his crop through factors in Mobile and invested the profits in more land, more slaves, more books for his ever-growing library. The slave population at Belle River had an unusual demographic profile and disproportionate number of light-skinned individuals, more children than the birth rate should have produced, and a disturbing pattern of families separated and sold away just as children reached adolescence. The overseer, a man named Jonas Pritchett, had worked at Belle River for 15 years. He lived in a cottage near the slave quarters and carried out the colonel's orders with mechanical precision. Pritchett kept his own records: punishment logs, work assignments, dietary restrictions for slaves the colonel had designated for his breeding program. These notebooks, written in Pritchett's cramped handwriting, documented atrocities with the casual tone of farming reports. Which women were forced into which cabins, which children were sired by which men, which pregnancies were terminated and by what methods. In the main house, Sarah and Catherine understood more than their father realized. They read his journals when he traveled to Mobile on business. They listened at doors and gathered fragments of conversations between Pritchett and the colonel. They knew what happened in the quarters after dark, knew which of the slaves were their half-siblings, knew that their father viewed human beings as experimental subjects in his personal laboratory of racial theory, and they learned to hate him with a cold, patient fury that would have terrified him if he'd recognized it. The morning of February 3rd, 1847 arrived with unseasonable warmth, temperatures climbing into the low 60s even before noon. Colonel Sutton had spent the previous evening in his study, working by lamplight on correspondence with a professor at the Medical College of South Carolina. The household staff noticed nothing unusual when he failed to appear for breakfast. He often worked through the night and slept late. It was Pritchett who found him at 10:30, slumped in his leather chair with papers scattered across his desk. The colonel's face had a greyish tinge, and when Pritchett touched his hand to wake him, the skin felt cold and waxy. Dr. Amos Grayfield arrived from Hayneville 2 hours later and pronounced Colonel Nathaniel Sutton dead, estimating the time of death as sometime between midnight and dawn. Heart seizure, Dr. Grayfield declared, barely glancing at the body. Man was 56 years old, worked himself to exhaustion. I'd warned him about his choleric temperament and excessive mental strain. The heart gives out, simple as that. But several details didn't align with this tidy diagnosis. The colonel's dinner tray, brought to the study at 8 o'clock the previous evening, sat on a side table with the food barely touched. A cup of coffee, long since gone cold, showed a peculiar residue at the bottom, a fine sediment that glittered faintly in the lamplight. The colonel's final letter, addressed to his attorney in Mobile, remained unfinished mid-sentence. I have made certain arrangements regarding the future of my daughters, which must be executed precisely as stipulated, for their own protection and for the preservation of my life's work. Should any person attempt to—" The sentence ended there, the pen trailing off the page, as if his hand had suddenly lost strength. Sarah and Catherine stood together in the hallway outside their father's study, wearing matching black mourning dresses that they'd somehow procured despite having no prior knowledge of his death. Their faces showed no tears, no evidence of shock or grief. They held hands, fingers interlaced, and watched the proceedings with identical expressions of watchful calm. "We should examine him more thoroughly," suggested Mr. Harold Breckenridge, a neighboring planter who'd arrived to pay his respects. "Nathaniel was in good health last month when I saw him at the courthouse. This seems rather sudden." The colonel worked himself into the grave. "Doctor," Grayfield snapped, irritated at having his professional judgment questioned. "I've seen it 100 times. The body simply gives out. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to speak with the daughters about funeral arrangements." But Dr. Grayfield never got that conversation. Sarah addressed him first, her voice perfectly modulated and cold as January rain. "Dr. Grayfield, we appreciate your prompt attendance. The funeral will be held 3 days hence with burial in the family plot. Mr. Jeremiah Osgood, our father's attorney from Mobile, has been summoned and should arrive by tomorrow evening. Until such time as the will is read and the estate settled, Catherine and I will manage the plantation affairs. Pritchett will continue as overseer under our direct supervision." The men in the room exchanged glances. Women didn't manage plantations, certainly not unmarried women barely 22 years old. And there was something else, something they couldn't quite articulate. A sense that Sarah and Catherine had been waiting for this moment, that they'd rehearsed these words and knew exactly how events would unfold. "Now, Miss Sarah," Mr. Breckenridge began in the patronizing tone men reserved for women discussing matters beyond their comprehension, "you can't seriously expect to—" "Our father educated us specifically for this eventuality," Catherine interrupted, her voice a mirror of her sister's. "We understand crop rotation, market factors, the management of field labor. We've studied his methods for years. This plantation will continue to operate at its current level of productivity." What the men didn't know, couldn't know, was that Sarah and Catherine had prepared for this day for months. They'd studied their father's account books, memorized the names and capabilities of every enslaved person on the property, learned which merchants in Hayneville could be manipulated and which needed to be avoided. They'd planned for every contingency except one, the specific contents of their father's will. The funeral took place on February 6th, under gray skies that threatened rain but never delivered. 43 neighbors and business associates attended, gathering in the parlor where the colonel's body lay in a walnut casket lined with white satin. The Reverend Samuel Yates from Hayneville's Presbyterian Church delivered a eulogy that praised the colonel's contributions to Alabama's agricultural prosperity and his devotion to advancing scientific knowledge. Not one enslaved person from Bell River attended the service, though they gathered in the quarters that evening for their own ceremony, a mixture of Christian hymns and older traditions, singing songs that celebrated liberation and the settling of accounts. They kept their voices low, but the sound carried across the fields to where Sarah and Catherine sat on the main house veranda, listening. "They think they're free now," Sarah said softly. "They'll learn differently," Catherine replied. Jeremiah Osgood arrived from Mobile the evening after the funeral, a portly man of 50 with silver hair and the careful manner of someone accustomed to delivering bad news to people who could afford to make his life difficult. He carried a leather satchel containing Colonel Sutton's will and several sealed documents marked for the twins' eyes only. The reading took place in the colonel's study, now thoroughly cleaned of any evidence of his final hours. Sarah and Catherine sat together on a settee, their black mourning dresses rustling slightly as they adjusted their positions. Pritchett stood by the door, uninvited but tolerated, his weathered face expressionless. Osgood opened his satchel and withdrew a thick document bound with black ribbon. Colonel Sutton revised his will on December 12, 1846, less than 2 months before his death. The provisions are unconventional. The document's opening paragraphs were standard: charitable bequests to the Presbyterian Church, personal items distributed to various acquaintances. Then Osgood reached the section concerning the plantation and its inhabitants. To my daughters Sarah and Catherine Sutton, I leave the entirety of Bell River Plantation, including all lands, structures, livestock, equipment, and human property, to be held jointly and equally between them. However, this bequest is conditional upon the following stipulations, which must be satisfied within 24 months of my death. Osgood paused, cleared his throat uncomfortably, and continued. First, both daughters must enter into lawful Christian marriage with men of suitable character and standing, approved by the executor of this estate. Second, both marriages must produce legitimate offspring within the stipulated time frame. Third, the daughters must maintain the plantation at current levels of productivity and demonstrate sound management of its resources. Sarah's hand tightened on Catherine's, their knuckles going white. Should these conditions not be met, Osgood read, his voice dropping lower, Bell River Plantation and all its assets shall be sold at public auction, with proceeds distributed equally among the following charitable institutions. The list included agricultural colleges, medical societies, and organizations dedicated to the advancement of scientific understanding of human populations. The colonel's final attempt to ensure his ideology outlived him. There's more, Osgood said, withdrawing a second document. A private letter to you both. He handed the sealed envelope to Sarah, who broke the wax seal with her thumbnail. Inside, their father's handwriting covered 3 pages of heavy cotton paper. Catherine leaned close, and they read together in silence. The letter explained the colonel's reasoning with chilling clarity. He'd observed their unnatural attachment to each other, their rejection of normal feminine interests in courtship and marriage. He'd concluded that they would never voluntarily separate, never form appropriate alliances with men who could continue his work and properly manage his estate. So he'd created a situation where they had no choice: marry and procreate, or lose everything. But the letter's final paragraph contained something more disturbing. I have made arrangements to ensure you choose wisely. My network of correspondence extends throughout the state and beyond. They will be watching, reporting back on your conduct and your choices. Remember always that you are what I made you, and you cannot escape the fundamental truth of your nature, no matter how you might pretend otherwise. The blood that flows through your veins is both your privilege and your prison. Sarah folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. When she looked up at Osgood, her expression betrayed nothing. We understand the terms. Who serves as executor? I do, along with Mr. Breckenridge as co-executor. We're charged with approving any marriage proposals and ensuring the conditions are met. 24 months, Catherine said. That gives us until February 1849. Correct. I must say, ladies, your father's provisions are highly irregular. Most attorneys would have counseled against. Our father's mind was entirely his own, Sarah interrupted. We'll comply with his wishes. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have plantation business to attend to. After Osgood left, promising to return in 6 months to assess their progress, the twins remained in the study. They sat in their father's chair, Catherine on the seat, Sarah perched on the armrest, and looked at the walls lined with journals and medical texts, at the ledgers documenting 2 decades of human experimentation disguised as agricultural management. We can't find suitable husbands in 24 months, Catherine said finally. He knew that. He designed this to fail. Not if we control every variable, Sarah replied. Father taught us that much. He believed humans could be bred like livestock, that every aspect of reproduction could be managed and directed. We'll prove him right, just not the way he intended. What are you suggesting? Sarah stood and moved to their father's desk, pulling open the bottom drawer where he'd kept his most private records. She withdrew a leather-bound journal and flipped it open to a page marked with a silk ribbon. Father's breeding logs. He documented everything, which combinations produced which results, which bloodlines he considered superior, which individuals he designated for his program. Catherine joined her, reading over her shoulder. The entries were clinical, dehumanizing, describing people as if they were cattle. Purchased male, approximately 25 years, from Williamson Estate. Good teeth, strong back, quick to learn tasks. Letters visible on back indicate prior ownership in Virginia, paired with female number 4. Results: 1 male child, sold 1837. 1 female child, retained for future breeding. He was a monster, Catherine whispered. He was, Sarah agreed. But he was also thorough, and somewhere in these records is the solution to our problem. Over the following weeks, Sarah and Catherine absorbed themselves in their father's documentation. They discovered the full scope of his obsessions: journals spanning 20 years, detailed genealogies, physical measurements, observations on temperament and capability. He treated Bell River as a laboratory, its enslaved population as experimental subjects, all in service of his theories about racial hierarchies and human improvement. But within that documentation they found something unexpected: evidence of intelligence, resilience, and resistance among the very people their father had tried to reduce to data points. Slaves who'd taught themselves to read despite prohibitions. Women who'd used herbs and folk knowledge to control their own fertility, quietly subverting the Colonel's breeding program. Men who'd sabotaged equipment and slowed productivity in ways that appeared accidental. Their father had noted these deficiencies without recognizing them as acts of rebellion. One name appeared repeatedly in the later journals, always with annotations of frustration: Ruth, their mother. The Colonel had purchased her expecting a compliant bearer of children for his experiments. Instead, he'd found a woman who resisted him in subtle, persistent ways, teaching her daughters to read when he was away, whispering to them about the life she'd known before slavery, planting seeds of doubt about his absolute authority. "She tried to protect us," Catherine said, tracing her finger over their mother's name in the ledger. "Even when she couldn't save herself." "Then we owe her more than survival," Sarah replied. "We owe her victory." But victory required resources, time, and one more element they didn't yet possess: a man they could control completely, whose presence would satisfy the letter of their father's will while violating its spirit entirely. The solution arrived in late April, though they didn't recognize it immediately. The spring auction in Hayneville drew sellers and buyers from across central Alabama, transforming the courthouse square into a marketplace of human misery. Enslaved people stood on a raised platform, while white men examined them like livestock, checking teeth and muscle tone, asking invasive questions about work history and health. The air smelled of dust and sweat and fear. Sarah and Catherine attended with Pritchett, ostensibly to purchase additional field hands for the expanded acreage they planned to cultivate. They wore black veils, still in mourning, which gave them anonymity in the crowd and allowed them to observe without being observed too closely. The morning sales proceeded predictably. Field workers going to plantation owners, domestic slaves to town families, children torn from parents and sold to different buyers. Then, shortly before noon, something unusual appeared on the auction block. "Next lot," the auctioneer called. "Property of the Granville estate, recently deceased. One male, age approximately 28, name of Marcus. Got his letters, can figure, worked as a house servant and tutor to the Granville children. No history of rebellion, no attempts to run. Starting bid, $1,000. Marcus stood on the platform with straight posture and level gaze, neither defiant nor submissive. He wore clean but worn clothing, and his hands, the hands of someone who worked with ledgers rather than cotton, showed no calluses. His skin was several shades lighter than most of the people sold that morning, suggesting mixed ancestry. But what caught Sarah's attention was something else entirely: the way he scanned the crowd. Not with the defeated resignation she expected, but with calculation, as if he was evaluating potential buyers just as they evaluated him. "Educated slaves are risk," someone in the crowd called out. "Gets ideas above his station. Perfect for a household that needs bookkeeping done," the auctioneer countered. "How many of you can balance your own accounts? Here's a man who can do it for you. Now do I hear 1,000? The bidding opened slowly. Most planters didn't want an educated male slave. Too much potential for trouble, for reading abolitionist newspapers, for forging travel passes. But a few town merchants showed interest, seeing value in someone who could manage their stores or handle correspondence. Sarah leaned close to Pritchett. "Bid." "Miss Sarah, we don't need—" "Bid." Pritchett raised his hand. 1,000. 1,200, countered a merchant from Montgomery. 1,300, Pritchett called. The bidding climbed to 1,600 before the Montgomery merchant dropped out, shaking his head at the inflated price for a single male slave, educated or not. Sarah had paid more than market value, a fact that would fuel gossip in the weeks ahead. Marcus was delivered to Bell River 3 days later, walking the 8 miles from Hayneville with his few possessions in a cloth bag. Pritchett met him at the plantation entrance and led him directly to the main house, where Sarah and Catherine waited in the study. "You can read and write," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." Marcus's voice was educated, careful, revealing nothing of what he might be thinking. "You tutored the Granville children. What did you teach them?" "Reading, writing, arithmetic, some geography and history. Whatever their father requested." Catherine circled him slowly, appraising. "The Granvilles were known abolitionists, Quakers, I believe. They allowed their slaves to be educated?" For the first time, something flickered in Marcus's eyes. Wariness, perhaps, or recognition that this conversation was more complicated than it appeared. "Mr. Granville believed all people possessed souls and minds worthy of development, ma'am." "And you?" Sarah asked. "What do you believe?" "I believe I'm standing in front of 2 women who paid too much for me and who clearly have something specific in mind beyond field labor." The twins exchanged glances. Their father had taught them to view enslaved people as objects, incapable of analysis or autonomous thought. Marcus had just demonstrated both within 30 seconds. "We have an unusual situation," Sarah said carefully. "Our father died recently, leaving conditions on our inheritance that require creative solutions. We need someone educated, discreet, and capable of understanding complex arrangements." "What kind of arrangements?" "The kind that must remain private within this household," Catherine replied. "You'll live in the main house, not the quarters. You'll have access to our father's library. You'll be treated well, fed properly, given freedoms that would be extraordinary elsewhere. But in exchange, you'll do exactly what we say, when we say it, without question or hesitation." Marcus was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet. "And if I refuse these unnamed terms, then you'll be sold south," Sarah said flatly. "To cotton plantations in Mississippi where educated slaves are worked to death in the fields to break them of any intellectual pretensions. I can have you on a boat within a week." It wasn't an empty threat, and Marcus clearly knew it. "What do you want from me?" "That depends," Catherine said. "Can you keep secrets, even ones that could be used as weapons?" "I've kept secrets my entire life, ma'am. Had to survive." Sarah walked to the window, looking out across the plantation grounds. "Our father's will requires us to marry within 24 months or lose everything. But we have no intention of submitting to marriages arranged by men who view us as property to be managed. So we're going to subvert the terms while technically fulfilling them." "I don't understand." "You will," Catherine said. "But first we need to know if you can be trusted, completely and absolutely." Over the following days, Sarah and Catherine tested Marcus in ways both subtle and overt. They gave him access to their father's library and watched what he read. They asked his opinions on political matters and listened for hints of abolitionist sympathies. They observed how he interacted with the other enslaved people at Bell River, whether he attempted to organize or agitate. Marcus proved remarkably adaptable. He kept to himself, spoke carefully, and demonstrated an intelligence that had clearly been honed through years of navigating dangerous social terrain. He understood that educated slaves existed in a precarious position, valuable enough to be kept, dangerous enough to be feared.